The Crusades, that time when Christianity randomly decided to invade the Middle East to reclaim Jerusalem. They tried several times. The first time was successful, the others not so much. And then came the plague. Or at least that's how my school summarized the Crusades. But since I'm a curious person, I did some research on my own, and I discovered that the Crusades are more complicated and interesting than most of the people realize. To prove my point, today we will do a summary of all the major Crusades. Hello damsels and knights, I'm Godwin and this is The Crusades, Oversimplified. Let's start with some considerations first. It's important to remember that the Crusades were not limited to the Middle East. These military operations were launched in different parts of Europe through the centuries, from the Baltic Sea to Spain, from France to the Danube. Speaking of Spain, the famous Reconquista was basically a crusade, a very long one, but still a crusade. Over the years, these expeditions were even launched against single individuals or groups of people. With that in mind, we can start our journey with the First Crusade. We usually start our discussion of this crusade at the Council of Clermont, where Pope Urbanus II launched the expedition in 1095. But to understand why he did so, we must go back to the year 1071. The Battle of Manzikert. This is where the domino effect that will lead to the First Crusade began. Let's see how. The battle was fought between the Seljuk Turks and the army of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Romans lost. Badly. So badly that Anatolia became a free real estate for the Seljuks. And not just Anatolia. Obviously, the Romans wanted their lands back, and here we meet one of the protagonists of the First Crusade, Emperor Alexios Komnenos. He realized that he needed help to reconquer Anatolia, help from the West. So he sent a letter to the Pope asking him to send military aid to fight the Seljuks. Now you have to remember that the Great Schism, which divided the Western and Eastern churches, happened only 40 years ago. So the relations between the Latins and the Greeks were a little cold. But fortunately for Alexios, the Pope liked the idea, because the Seljuk Turks were also his enemies in a way. You see, the Seljuks invaded and controlled an important piece of land through which pilgrims passed to reach Jerusalem. The pilgrimage was important in those days, and the Turks were not as tolerant as the Arabs were towards the Christians. So the Pope had an idea. If I am sending an army to help the Romans fight the Turks in Anatolia, why not go all the way to Jerusalem? So the idea of a crusade was born. As you know, no king or emperor took part in this crusade, because it was basically a papal-sponsored event. They didn't like the idea of being under the Pope. I mean, the investiture controversy was still going on between the emperor and the Pope, and the Pope was on the winning side. Also, just to know, the King of France, Philippe I, was excommunicated, and the Holy Roman Emperor at the time was Heinrich IV, the same man that had to fight Pope Gregorius VII during the investiture controversy. So, while the Pope's words spread across the nations, the nobles decided to gather all in one place, Constantinople. Here are some of the leaders of this vast army that crossed Europe in the name of God. In 1096, they all arrived in Constantinople, and from there they marched across Anatolia. After the conquest of Nicaea and the battle against the Seljuks at Dorylaeum, we focus a little on the siege of Antioch, the turning point of this crusade. There is a perfect word to describe this event: exhaustion. Antioch was a well-defended city, and the Crusaders had spent many months of hard work before finally entering the city. Some leaders even left the crusade. Imagine how these men felt when they saw a new Seljuk army outside the city walls. The besiegers became the besieged. Morale was low and all seemed lost, but then something miraculous happened. Somebody found a piece of the Holy Lance, and this relic gave the Crusaders an incredible morale boost. Now even the papal legate had some doubts that the relic might be fake, but in some situations a lie is better than the truth. With the power of desperation, our protagonists marched out of the city and, after a fierce battle, defeated the enemy and finally conquered Antioch. Now, it was time to go all the way to Jerusalem. The Holy City was besieged for a month, and in August 1099 the Crusaders entered the city and literally killed everyone, committing a massacre so horrific that even back then it was considered a bit much. After this journey, many went home, but others thought, "We've conquered so much land. Why don't we keep it?" So the Crusader states were born, with the most important one being the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The remaining leaders elected Godefroy de Bouillon as King of Jerusalem, but he refused the title. He chose the more humble, and I would say, epic, Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, defender of the Holy Sepulchre. He died a year later, in 1100, and was succeeded by his brother Baudouin. So that was the First Crusade. Let's put a victory on the scoreboard. We'll see how the score will be at the end, crusade by crusade. Now it's time for the sequel, the Second Crusade. In 1144, the county of Edessa fell into Seljuk hands, so the Crusader states asked for help in the West, and the West responded with a crusade. This time the King of France Louis VII with his wife, the famous Eleanor of Aquitaine, and the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III, with his nephew, the future Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa, took part in the crusade. Thanks to the powerful speeches of Bernard de Clairvaux and the participation of a king and an emperor, the hype surrounding this crusade was huge. The Crusaders passed through Constantinopolis and, after some losses in Anatolia, arrived in Acre, where they held a meeting with the nobility of Jerusalem. Instead of trying to reconquer the county of Edessa, they decided to capture the enemy city of Damascus. I'll give you a few seconds to think about how long the siege lasted. 5 months? No. 2 months? No. 2 weeks? No. Only 5 freaking days. From the 24th of July from the 28th of July, 1148. I mean, it was so short that they didn't have time to set up the siege towers or the catapults. They arrived, saw that the situation was too risky, and lifted the siege. After this failure, they all went back home. The crusade was over. The hype for this expedition was as big as the delusion that it was. But it wasn't all that bad. In the meantime, another Crusader army captured the city of Lisbon, making it eventually the capital of Portugal. So, this was the Second Crusade. A sequel that didn't live up to the original, but the producers will redeem themselves with the third incredible chapter. Time for the most famous crusade of them all, the third one. The catalyst for this crusade has a clear name: Saladin. The man founded the Ayyubid Sultanate, a powerful state that united all Muslim lands from Egypt to Mosul. But he had one more goal: recapture Jerusalem. His goal was achieved in 1187, when he entered the Holy City after defeating the whole army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the Battle of Hattin. The news was so terrible that the Pope died when he heard it. This time the King of France, Philippe II, the King of England, Richard the Lionheart, and the Holy Roman Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa joined the expedition to recapture Jerusalem. Friedrich, as you probably know, died before reaching Antioch. But what you don't know is that the rest of his army died due to an outbreak of a disease, and then a harsh winter struck the remaining soldiers. Imagine how unlucky you have to be to die of cold in Syria. In the meantime, Saladin conquered almost all of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, except for Tyre. The crusade began with the recapture of Acre in 1191, a key city in the former Kingdom of Jerusalem. After this siege, the Third Crusade was essentially the Crusaders marching south to reach Jerusalem, recapturing every city they encounter, while Saladin tried, unsuccessfully, to stop them. The Christians were led only by Richard, because after nearly dying of illness during the siege of Acre, the King of France returned home, and also because he didn't really care about the crusade at all. Once captured Ascalon, the Crusaders traveled inland to Jerusalem, but Richard understood that to take the city, they would have to cut off the reinforcements from Egypt, so he stopped the army before they could begin the siege. Twice. There was a stalemate, with Richard running out of time and Saladin running out of resources. So in 1192 they made an agreement. All the lands conquered by the Lionheart remained in Christian hands, but Jerusalem remained under Muslim rule, but the Christians could visit the Holy City, if unarmed. I don't know how to judge this crusade. The goal was Jerusalem, and they failed. But most of the kingdom was retaken, which cannot be taken for granted. I give half point for the victory and half for the defeat. Basically a draw. The Fourth Crusade, the deviation. It's 1202 and Pope Innocent III wants to recapture Jerusalem. It decided that the Christian army will travel by sea, and who better than Venice to build a navy for the Crusades? The Venetians built the navy in exchange for a certain amount of money, but at the time of departure, the Crusaders that arrived in Venice were fewer than expected. They couldn't pay all the money they agreed. The ruler of Venice, Doge Enrico Dandolo, offered a deal. Venice will not pretend all the money they wanted, but in exchange, the Crusaders will help the Venetians retake a rebel city, Zara. So the Crusaders sailed to the city and conquered it. But there, the Crusaders received an interesting offer. Alexios IV Angelos asked the Latins to help him restore his father to the throne of the Eastern Roman Empire in exchange for military aid in the crusade and money. A lot of money. Doge Dandolo, being a Venetian, saw the potential in this deal. Potential for Venice. He persuaded most of the Crusaders to go to Constantinopolis. So, in 1204, Alexios's father became emperor again, but he was deposed shortly afterwards, and the new emperor refused to pay the Crusaders. So they did the most wise and peaceful thing to do in this cases. They destroyed the city and tore it down brick by brick, creating one of the most horrendous sieges of all time. A lot of what you see in Venice today is either taken directly from Constantinopolis or was built with the money that came from that siege. The Eastern Roman Empire fell, and even if it was restored in 1261, it would never be the same. This siege was the decisive blow on the Eastern Roman Empire's story. This adventure started as a crusade, but ended up being something else. So for me, that goes straight into the do not finished category. Despite the events of the Fourth Crusade, the new Pope Honorius III launched another crusade to retake Jerusalem in 1217. This time, they aimed to conquer Egypt. The idea was to take the center of reinforcements for Jerusalem's defense. The Crusaders successfully captured Damietta, an important port on the Nile Delta. The Sultan al-Kamil offered peace terms, but the Latins refused and tried to take Cairo. This led to a heavy defeat in the Battle of Mansoura that eventually ended the crusade, with the returning of Damietta under Muslim rule. With this crusade, we sign a loss on the scoreboard. This crusade was as successful as its unpopularity among most of the people. This is the situation. In 1227, the new pope, Gregorius IX, wanted to recapture Jerusalem. The king of Sicily and Holy Roman Emperor Federico II more than once promised to go on a crusade, but words did not become facts. So he ordered him to organize a crusade by himself and reclaim the holy city. But Federico was a different man. Being raised in a multi-ethnical land like Norman Sicily and having some relations with the Muslim world, he had an idea. Why not try to negotiate the purchase of Jerusalem? Federico arrived in Jerusalem in 1228, where the following agreement was made. The Sultan ceded the city of Jerusalem, with Bethlehem and a corridor of territory connecting it to the rest of the kingdom. He also recognized the Christian possession of Nazareth and Sidon, and a 10 years truce between the Christians and Muslims. The holy city was taken without a fight. In the meantime, the Pope excommunicated Federico and imposed an interdict on Jerusalem. But this is a story for another time, so we add a victory on the scoreboard. The hype for the Crusades was beginning to decline, but one man tried to keep the flame of the Crusades alive. A man, or I should say a saint, King Louis IX of France, aka Saint Louis. In 1244, Jerusalem fell into Muslim hands. Again. So, Pope Innocentius IV and Louis organized a crusade to conquer Egypt. Again. This crusade followed the same pattern as the fifth one. The Christians took Damietta, refused to negotiate with the enemy, and marched into the Nile Delta, where they were again defeated at the Battle of Mansoura in 1250. The king was captured, and after the ransom was paid, Louis spent 4 years in Acre reinforcing the Crusader states, and then returned home. This was the last major crusade in the Middle East. Technically, there's the Eighth Crusade, led again by Louis in 1270, but it was a short, disastrous adventure in Tunis, where he even died. So we add another loss to the scoreboard that is now complete. As you can see from the scoreboard, The Crusades weren't that complete failure that the school told us. This was a short summary of the 7 major crusades in the Middle East. If you like the content, let me know if you want to see dedicated videos to all the Crusaders in depth. Thanks for watching. See you next time.